And good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Victoria de Grazia to discuss The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy. First, some Zoom housekeeping. You're in a webinar. The chat is closed, but you might want to keep the chat window open because I'll be dropping links in the chat window to purchase The Perfect Fascist from Literati Bookstore. And you can also use the Q&A portion or feature of the webinar to ask questions for the author at any time. So whenever you feel compelled to ask a question, again, you can do so using the Q&A feature available to you through the webinar. And I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. As a reminder, you can purchase The Perfect Fascist on our website. I'm including a link in the chat shortly. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there will be links in the description below where you can purchase from our store. Thousands of titles additionally are available for curbside pickup from our bookstore if you live in Southeast Michigan. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where in the world and when in the world you may be joining us from. Thanks to the power of the internet, we appreciate it, and we appreciate your continued support of all that we're doing at Literati Bookstore. So without further ado, I will introduce our author and our moderators this evening. Victoria de Grazia is more collegiate professor of history, at Columbia University and a founding editor of Radical History Review. Her widely translated prize-winning books include Irresistible Empire, America's Advance Through 20th Century Europe, and How Fascism Ruled Women. She has received the Woodrow Wilson, Jean Monnet, and Guggenheim Fellowships and the Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome. And she's joined by Pamela Ballinger, is the Fred Cuny Chair in History of Human Rights at the University of Michigan, and Giorgio Bertellini is a visual historian and professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Media at the University of Michigan as well. Please, they won't be able to hear you, but they will be able to feel you in spirit. Join me in welcoming them to your living rooms. Take it away.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm Victoria de Grazia. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm going to briefly present what my book is about, The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality, by sharing with you some of the photographs of the book, which were very, very important to me to do the research. So I'm going to give you a kind of narrative where I started. And this is where I started. I was given bagfuls of papers by a woman's family. Her name was Liliana Weinman Teruzzi, and she was born in 1899, okay? Died in 1987. And she left these bags. And when I opened them up, I wasn't that really interested. I really didn't think there was probably that much there. I found wedding album, and one of the very first photographs I saw was this one. There is the bride, there is the groom over here, there, and there right in the center is Benito Mussolini. Reading further, there were many, many clippings in the bags. There was one from the New York Times which spoke of it as a fascist wedding, a June wedding in Rome. And this couldn't but intrigue me. And so I began, in effect, the search for what this is about. Now, for the family, their main question, the people who brought me this, was why did this young woman, very, very talented, young rising opera star, marry this fascist, much older than she was, with a beard. And of course, he wasn't Jewish, and her family was. They were religious enough Jews. They were becoming more and more assimilated, but nonetheless, they were people of faith. And she had married both in the church and in a civil ceremony. She struck me as less problematic. That is, reading through, it was clear that she was an extraordinary talent. So indeed, it was a question why she married this big fascist. But for me, a bigger question, because I was very much interested in understanding fascism, and this seemed to give me a kind of behind the scenes possibility of looking into it. The big question was, why did this man marry this woman? In other words, became very curious as why this fascist, especially as I looked at him and looked through his work, didn't find much about him, what led him to marry this woman in 1926, just as the regime was settling down and Mussolini was urging his men to get out of the piazzas, go home, find a nice wife, and have children. So she, up and coming, here she is in her early career, having left the stage, marries this man. Here he is, the power couple, happy power couple, circa 1926. You can see him there, these very fancy kind of poses, which were the period. Well, what about him? So it turned out for 20 years, from 1899 to 1920, he had been a good soldier. In other words, I began to explore now, getting in. These are photographs. You can see him here. Okay, here he is at after the Battle of Baharuga in the Libyan War in 1914. He was a captain of colonial troops. The Italians used Eritreans almost exclusively in this early part, and he was one of the captain then I'm sorry, captain. He was actually a lieutenant in the Libyan War. We won bronze and a silver medal for being wounded. And here they are in one of these submission ceremonies, and he's, big bearded colonial soldier. Moving on, he's clearly wanted to be an officer and a gentleman. Look for him here. This is now 1913. He's now a full lieutenant. Here we see him again in the captain in the Italian front, 1915 to 1970. But what's important here, beginning to think about now, who is this person? That he was an aide de camp, 2 silver medals, acting under very, very harsh, difficult circumstances on the Italian front, which was one of the worst in the war. And he left the war as a battalion major in Libya between 1917 and 1920. What I wanted to show here for a moment, is because this allows you to sort of move out, is that this Teruzzi, if we begin to follow him, okay, he's in Eritrea, down in the Horn of Africa, Italian Eritrea. He's then going to be seeing him in Libya, okay. The Libyan War, we're going to be able to see that Italy was actually much more at war than is usually assumed. That is, if we looked out here, that already from 1911 on, Italy was breaking out of its non-imperialist sort of being and beginning now to look down to form up this idea of a Euro-Africa, that it would have a Mediterranean space and it would have down here also a big space in Africa, and that it was beginning to compete then with France and with Britain to try to create its own imperial space. And this is a problem that Italian scholars certainly take very seriously, but I'd never seen it really incorporated in any single person. So more and more I began to see that this man is part of a long military tradition. But the important point for the book is, how does somebody become a fascist? Fascists are not born, they're made. This is something I began to see more and more clearly. For the first 20 years, he's a good soldier. For the next 25 years, from 20 to 45, he is an unwavering fascist, an unusually loyal fascist. And given his background, a kind of lowly background, coming from Milan, volunteered to go into the army because he clearly wasn't going to make it in business. He goes very high. That is higher than I could have understood when they just married in 1926. And indeed, he'll be one of the people who's longest in power. That is from 1920, when he joins to become head of the squads in Milan, down to 1945, when he's still at Mussolini's side. So he becomes more and more a figure who's like a zealot, like a cipher you could follow through. Also, because at a certain point, he is going to renounce his wife, accusing her of having betrayed him, a kind of Othello-like move, which then leaves him with no wife because he can't get a divorce in Italy. There's no divorce, and he's unable to get his marriage dissolved by the Catholic Church. But watch him now. Here you can see him over here, this bearded man, a true squadrista. That's a question I had. Could this man, a man of 38 years old, around the time of the March on Rome, been out beating up people, organizing squads? Yes, indeed. I found ample evidence of him with his, here he is. You can see in his fascist garb, and very sweaty after 3 days in which they had occupied and defenestrated the town council socialists of Milan, this in August 1922, 3 months before the March on Rome. And if we keep going, we can see him on the March on Rome. There he is, standing right behind Mussolini. He is like a fifth man here, because these are these famous quadrivirs who were the 4 men who were given charge of the entire March on Rome. But he was a commander of the Legion, and since he had these capacities as a military officer, he could find materiel, he knew how to kick butts to get very sloppily organized squads to keep marching on Rome. And because he was a handsome man, or that is handsome in a way that regular army officers usually never were not, they're rather more droopy-jawed, he attracted a lot of photographic attention to himself. Okay, we keep going just to kind of move through. Here we find that he has been now become governor of Cyrenaica. This is in 1928. So he's been promoted here to become the governor of the province of Cyrenaica. But that was just before that, he had been appointed the undersecretary of the Minister of the Interior. That's a very important policing position with a lot of power, and he was using it to kind of be a spy on behalf of Mussolini against the Minister of the Interior, and then engaging with Farinacci, the head of that party. So it was a kind of pivotal position which required, again, this loyalty. Here we see him with his own general from World War I, and he's become now Mussolini's, in effect, aide-de-camp as the head of the voluntary fascist militia, the black shirts, 350,000 strong, between 1929 and 1935. And you can see now this kind of posturing, which was very important for Mussolini. It showed that he had a military expertise, which of course he could not have had, having done the military training, but being part now, and this is a very important, not just of the regular army, having the regular army loyal to him, but through his commandment also the 350,000 black shirts who responded, not supposed directly to his command, in effect directly to his command. Okay. Moving on, we find Teruzzi as the general in command of the militia, the 1st Division during the Ethiopian War. We find him, he's promoted, and here he is with the Army Chief of Staff in Italo Balbo. We find him set on a secret mission, which was hardly secret at all, by Mussolini, to help Franco, General Islamo Franco, in 1937, after the terrible Italian defeat at Guadalajara, to reorganize the forces. And here he is at the Battle of Santander. So this kind of figure who's always there, but always behind the scenes. In 1936, he finds a new companion, and he has a daughter by her. And I say a new companion, this is important because she too is Jewish. He cannot marry her because he's married to other Jewish woman, so he can't dissolve his marriage to marry another Jewish woman by whom he has a daughter. There lies the story. Here, the little girl is in 1940, and this is going to become extremely complicated again after 1938, when the Italian fascists put in their race laws, by which this woman, who has no Italian nationality and is Jewish, and the little girl whose Jewishness may or may not come through her mother's side, given the Italian race laws, if they're applied properly, that this is going to create no end of trouble as the directives are put more and more into effect, and eventually when Italy is occupied by the Germans in 1943. By the end of 1939 to 1943, he has become Minister of Italian Africa at Terlizzi, and he's also been promoted Army Corps General in 1938. Remember, he was just a major when he ended his army active service in 1920. So he's now being moved from place to place. He's been various parts of the administration, but also retiring at the highest level of the army, short of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, here's where I think that the story now, it's always a global story, but by 1940, he is one of the yes men around Mussolini, who basically join very eagerly or stoically the alliance, the Axis alliance with Hitler, and join with him more and more by 1940 in the idea of forming a Nazi fascist new order. Here we see Terlizzi up here, all very, very handsome at the opera, with Von Epp, the plenipotentiary of the colonies, of the German colonies. And here he is in Germany, in Berlin in September 1940, just after the war has begun, parading around and saluting and fraternizing with very high Nazism and the high military. Okay. The point that I'll be making in the book, in some ways, it's very operatic. That is, it's about a man striving, a man grasping, a man overreaching, and ultimately the catastrophe. His life is very much synchronized with the regime. And so, if you want, the beginning of the fall is this joining more and more structurally with Nazi Germany, this new European hierarchy. So Italy's interests are no longer this Euro-Africa and the Mediterranean across, but they're joining with the German army in this expansion eastward, which will ultimately lead significant Italian regiments to join the Nazis, the German army at Stalingrad, and to participate in their defeat and the Great Retreat and the huge losses. Okay. Terlizzi is not participating in that. By that time, he's sort of pensioned out of the army, and he has much to do with trying to save the people, the Italians who have been abandoned in Africa, and return them, repatriate them between 1942 and 1943. Finally, we see that as things come down, he is more and more, was a notorious libertine, and more he's identified as that. So the sense of him being at once the most perfect of fascists, which he styled himself as being, and others in the hierarchy, would, if you want, agree with. He becomes known as the vampire of the empire. Here he's dancing in uniform in a denunciation published in 1941. Finally, he is a hierarch who has been deposed, retired. Here he is in the winter of 44 with his small daughter. They're hiding. They're hiding because the wife, the girlfriend, is Jewish, and the Germans and its fascists at that point were rounding up, Jews in northern Italy. And in those several months where the roundups were harshest, he had hidden in a small place with his family in the north of Lake Garda. Finally, he is the first hierarch to have been captured and tried by the good fortune that the partisans didn't kill him outright, and in prison another time. He goes back, if you want, to being the good soldier. He's assistant to the prison chaplain, the librarian of the penitentiary of Procida, where he stays for the longest period of any hierarch, for various reasons. And in 1950, when just after he released, he dies. So what we have here then is a narrative in some way. It is not really a biography, it's a social history more than that of a figure, because in some ways there wasn't enough documentation on him, but also I had real questions about, whether he, you could say, was interesting enough. In other words, where he's really interesting as an embodiment of so many qualities of the regime. It's extraordinary emotionality, it's constant reference to love in every sort of way. It's the power, the constant wielding of power in all kinds of distorted ways, which you can think more, which we could say are peculiarly fascist, have a peculiar configuration. And finally, this extraordinary, wobbly, to say the least, corrupted moral compass. Okay, so let me turn this back over now to my colleagues, and we'll continue to discuss then the themes of the book. Thank you.
There we go. It wasn't allowing me to unmute for a moment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So first of all, Victoria, thank you so much for this really important book. And it's also a really beautiful book, even though it's about terrible things. And it's, as I think you've suggested in your, as you've indicated in your comments, and you managed to use this particular life of Teruzzi and his two wives, if we want to call them that, Liliana and Yvette, to construct this very vast canvas, even as you keep together these narrative threads about their particular stories that sort of propel your narrative forward. And so you give the reader who doesn't have a lot of background in fascism a wonderful understanding of how fascism writ large and then fascist writ small, i.e. Teruzzi, were so seductive for so many people for so long. And you're really to be congratulated on keeping all of these threads together. At the same time, the book has so many lessons for scholars of fascism and for specialists on Italy. So as I was reading it, I appreciated your sketches of what, say, the everyday life of a governor of Cyrenaica looks like. I mean, I spent a lot of time working on Libya myself, but I never, I think, had quite that sense that I get from your book about what does the daily life of one of these functionaries look like? And for Teruzzi and Liliana, it ranged from the elite pleasures of going to this Giuliana beach to setting off with fishermen from Trapani as they were kicking off their annual tuna hunt or tuna catch in Libyan waters, to entertaining visiting dignitaries. In a very different context, you give us a window onto the daily life after the war of these jailed fascists in Croce prison. And we see Teruzzi, as you said, serving as a prison librarian, and then also the political prisoners, because they're together with non-political prisoners, essentially fanboying at the arrival of the brutal Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, who becomes the kind of celebrity, the big fish fascist in the prison. And you make very clear how fascist hierarchy endured even in a setting like that of the penitentiary, because Graziani, as you tell us, he got his own cell, a private cell. He had unlimited paper, unlike the other prisoners, and he used that paper and the time and the space that he had to write these very self-serving memoirs that would, in the end, largely rehabilitate his reputation in post-war Italy. And I'll just, a few more comments about, I think, the last part of the book, because you have a very detailed discussion of the different ways in which people sought to settle accounts for fascism. And these ranged from summary executions, and the most famous would be those of Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, special tribunals, courts to try collaborators, province by province, and then jail sentences for fascists, both big and small. And I think this discussion is really helpful because it underscores how Italy's reckoning with its fascist past may have ultimately been incomplete or disappointing to many, but it certainly wasn't absent altogether. And I bring this up because it's something I often hear people saying about Italian fascism. People will say, well, Italy never had a Nuremberg. And this is cited to explain a supposed amnesia, Italian amnesia about or lack of acknowledgement of the brutality of fascism, the failure to bring fascists to justice after the war, and then the rehabilitation of figures like Graziani, who committed atrocious crimes in the colonies. But while I think the failure to use instruments of international law to bring Italian war criminals to justice, and this was something, for example, that the Ethiopians pressed very hard for and at the then new United Nations, that's an incontrovertible fact. But that failure says as much about the continued commitments of France and Britain and other powers to colonialism in the post-war world, and then the exigencies of the emerging Cold War, as it does, I think, a lack of Italian will to prosecute war criminals. And you very carefully show, it's a very fine-tuned account, why it's an oversimplification to claim that Italy didn't experience any legal reckoning for the violence of the Ventennio, the 20 years of fascism, and then the war. And then certainly the well-documented extra-legal violence of retribution and the rituals of desecrating corpses of killed fascists and collaborators was very dramatic, and it made for a very different ending to the war in Italy than it did in Germany. You note that the score settling at the end of the war made for this very curious deaths, multiple deaths of Teruzzi, because there were a series of bearded corpses that were mistaken for his. And this struck me as a kind of reversal of the journey of the mutilated and then concealed body of the Duce that Sergio Luzzatto has traced out. As you tell us, Teruzzi was very much alive at the end of the war and would live the remainder of his life in this prison, except for a few days, the brief time after he was released before he died. But like the Duce, his body would later disappear and then reappear. But in this case, it's only because the impoverished Yvette Blanc needed the deposit back on the family mausoleum and had Teruzzi's remains reinterred in a small, barely marked crypt. So I just wanted to use these comments to highlight how much readers learn from your account, both about fascism, but also about how we can put together our narratives of fascism and fascist lives in ways that yield, as you say, quote, a much wider, more complex and more diverse world than we take it, that is fascism, to be. So I'm going to stop here. I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of these observations or if we turn it over to Giorgio, and then I have a series of questions later, but Giorgio and I will go back and forth after giving you obviously the word.
Okay, all right, so well, first of all, thank you and congratulations. This is a masterpiece for at least 15 reasons. I can't go into 15 reasons because we don't have the time, but I want to make it clear, make it sort of easier for those who haven't read it, what exactly it is. For me as a reader, you know, an average reader, I guess, first of all, this is an incredibly compelling narrative. Meaning it's a story incredibly well written, and it reads like a story, but at the same time it's a historical book. So who is Teruzzi? I have here a book called I gerarchi del fascismo, and it's divided in three parts. The famous hierarchy, right? The top echelon, the top officials of the regime. There are three parts. The first part is the main hierarchy, so Ciano, Grandi, Balbo, and so forth. The second part, I gregari, the secondary one. The third part, I dimenticati, the forgotten ones. And Teruzzi is in the forgotten ones. And it's a 5-line paragraph that ends with dotato di barba e baffi imponenti, like endowed with mustache and beard, and imposing beard and mustache. So you basically brought on the map a figure on which there was nothing of significance written. Teruzzi was there, was behind the Quadrumviri, but it wasn't, no, there wasn't a story, there wasn't a book on him, etc. Secondly, you brought into the picture Liliana, who we did not know. I mean, maybe some people knew about it, but she was not. You check De Felice, you check a number of other books, you check even your own dictionary of fascism, and she's not there. So there's a figure that was not mentioned. So you bring these to the fore together with archival research in Rome, Pavia, Milan, and then of course the New York. And you offer what I think is a departure from your previous books. And tell me if I'm wrong. In your other books, you made historical argument where the personal story would serve that argument. Here, you tell us personal story, and you need the historical argument, the historical contextualization to better understand that particular story, which has fascist connotations, right? There's fascism, there's fascist culture, both in their coming together, falling in love, and getting married, and there's a lot of fascist culture in how they try to, or he tried to separate himself from her, but there is, for the reader, there's a narrative, I call it narrative nonfiction, it's obviously not my expression, that it seems to me different from your previous work, and I wonder the extent to which you had to work. I mean, you probably have these, very broad stylistic toolbox, whether you had a model, whether it was difficult, because it was different. And in the context of the Italian readership, because this book is about to be translated by Einaudi, my reaction was, well, there are countless books on gerarchy, on these high-end officials, many of them, not at all, I mean, not apologizing, but sort of defending the regime, and of horrible historical quality, right? If you want to write a book on a gerarcha, this is it, right? This is the new model. But it seems to me that there is an access to fascism that this book provides while telling a story that other books do not necessarily provide, because they engage in a serious historical argument. And so there is an element, should I say, of public history attached to this book that in the context of Italy would really resonate, I suppose. I don't know how people will read it, particularly at a time when the top literary awards are won by this guy, Scurati, who has now just published the second volume of a novelization of Mussolini's life. These are called, M, Il Figlio del Secolo. These are 800 pages book that sells, hundreds of thousands of copies. So there is a context in which this narrative nonfiction could really sort of create debate, etc. And I certainly welcome that, because this is a model of how to do the story of these gerarchy. The other question, I mean, I have many others, but I want to stop, is obviously related to the Weinman archive, which you had, I guess, a special access to. And in the book, you address her by first name, and you address him by last name. So I'd like to know more about that choice, because we obviously side with her, but you're very skilled at letting us know that A, she's not a victim, B, that sometimes you don't know why she did what she did. You are left to conjectures, but you're not giving the reader, a prepackaged explanation of why she did what she did, which obviously brings up the broader question of individual psychology vis-a-vis the sort of totalitarian narratives that we tell ourselves about fascism. I mean, there are certain explanations about individuals' actions that do not necessarily fit straightforwardly, easily, effortlessly, the narrative of fascism. And this, to me, this contrast is really what makes the book, not just you can't stop reading it, but you want to know more and more and more. And so I as a reader, I really thank you for giving me this treat.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. I'm going to put some of the questions together. So I'm going to start with the archive, some of Giorgio's questions. I think that, you know, our audience hears archive. What does that mean? Well, you know, we all have archives probably of some sort. In other words, if we die, we'll leave little handfuls of something or lots of things. And in this case, we're talking about a little few bagfuls of stuff that one of the woman who brought it to me she was very afraid that they would just get thrown out. And these bags, and you know, I gradually sort of unraveled them. And what was important, in the way of discovery, you'd say, my God, these photographs. And then there was a whole set of photographs on, you saw one of them, him as a commander of troops, getting the Arabs to submit in Libya. I said, my God, that's just my stuff. You know, this violence, this fascist violence, a whole slew of those photographs taken by the army photographer. Oh, I said, this is amazing. And then there were letters, but I didn't pay much attention to them. At first, I went to another item, and that was this annulment record. Now, an annulment record is the result of a secret process in the Catholic Church, usually quite complicated. Now, it's become less so, especially in the United States, whereby the marriage is dissolved. That is, it's never taken place. Because there was some flaw in it to start with. That is, that the two did not believe in marriage, and therefore they lied when they swore their oath to one another, or they were first cousins, or they one didn't reveal who his real identity was, or they had some impediment which wasn't revealed, or they couldn't consummate the marriage. A very medieval kind of thing. But so this annulment record was so striking in itself. I said, wow, this is a sort of document that is rare. And so, you know, you begin, historians, you know, they'll start digging. But of course, I would never have dug on its own. I'd say, this is interesting because it gets me. I'm going to be able to drive a stake through this guy's heart by the end. I'm going to be able to just get him. I'm going to nail him. I'm going to nail him. This sort of idea, both as an historian, but also as a sort of a political engagement to nail the fascists. Thereby, everything would be revealed about him, all his power, and it in some ways would dissipate as a result of this huge sort of labor of trying to figure out who did what he did. And if you think about it, everybody, marriage is an amazing institution. You know, whether you like it or you don't like it, you believe it or don't believe it, how many marriages you've had. Because in some ways, it's very foundational. That's the basis on which people have children. That's the way people decide on their orientation, what kind of marriage, what their social status, how they think about the future. So if a marriage is bound together, and especially one which is supposed to last for all eternity, at least so long as they are on earth, because they're married in the Catholic Church and in the civil ceremony, which doesn't allow a divorce, you can imagine then the kind of complication which emerges when the man acts like some sort of Othello and renounces, because of these Iagos around who are plotting and make him jealous, this woman, and with great public drama. So it's, my God, what kind of story is this? It seems like an opera. And then to find further, keep digging and to find this man then not having a wife under fascism was really a hardship, because Mussolini wanted him to settle down, have children, stop running around in his uniform at night, consorting with actresses and trying to find love all the time. He was always, you know, kind of swaying, looking for love. And it was very complicated. You know, you've got the head of the militia who, you know, can't keep his pants buttoned, and then, you know, keeps finding the wrong kind of woman and so on. And since he was close to Mussolini, this made it even more problematic. But what comes out of that then is the archive, a problematic, that what is this fascist? You know, what makes him a fascist? How does he behave? What qualities does he have? which seems so melodramatic, so exaggerated. Why is he rising so high, and why is he always around? When in fact nobody thinks of him as anybody important. What were his qualities that he endures, and then he meets this fate? So I like to think of it in some ways coming out of that woman's archive, and then seeing, because the way it's set up, that I thought she would be, like the heroine, that maybe it could be a couple story, but that's not my thing. I'm not going to be writing about power couples, but rather it's sort of a woman's way, maybe a feminist way to think, hey, I'm going to teach a lot about fascism. In other words, I'm going to use this love story because love story and a story of a marriage really does dig you all in places you'd never think you're going to go in a totalitarian regime. Where you think, there's not going to be any private, it's going to be all black, it's going to be pure violence. And instead, life goes on in very creepy ways and in very harsh ways. And that becomes sort of the upshot of this, of following this marriage over time. It's also a way to show that people all have public lives and private lives. And under authoritarian regimes, we know this, under despotic regimes, they get pretty crazy. And then Caligula points his horse, to the Senate famously. Well, we've seen, other politicians do sort of similar types of things. And despotism allows all kinds of misbehaviors going back and forth between private interest and public interest, because it gets quite completely lost in the way that power is organized. So again, archive, the woman's archive, then it leads gradually through this research to many, many other kinds of archives, which begin to render more and more the richness of the society. I mean, to call it rich seems grotesque, but I think if we don't understand how emotion-bound this was, how exciting fascism was, right until the bombs started to be dropped by the Americans, and the war was so utterly lost, so obviously lost, that it created this kind of accelerated times, encouraged a certain kind of enormous passions being played out in the public realm, but then slipping over into the private realm and back and forth, sloshing around. Whether the question that Professor Ballinger raised about the violence, that too struck me. I mean, I was struck when you're writing about people's private life and what they want, their ideals, and it's very peaceful. They want children, they want to have a nice time, they want to live well, they want to go to the seaside, they want to go on vacation. And this Liliana, she was big on pampering herself and being pampered. I mean, she was a diva. She was trained that way, and she was structured that way, and she was her Jewish parents' very, very adored child. So you get the kind of love and passion and so on, and then boom, the violence just cuts right in there. You just can't escape it. It's there. So you sort of go along a little bit, peaceful private life, doing this and that, and all of a sudden the violence keeps coming out again and again and again and again, and this on the home front, but then these incessant wars. I mean, it's hard to realize. We think of Italy and the Ethiopian War, Italy in World War II, but no, there was a Italo-Senussi War in the 1920s, two of them, and there's this concentration camps that are set up, as well known, between 1930 and 1934, where all the lots and lots of Cyrenaians, Libyans, are probably 100,000, 120,000 are put in these concentration camps, and maybe 80,000 of them died. The animals are moved. They're concentration camps, which they call concentration camps, are set up in the desert. And then Italy at war again with Ethiopia in 1935, 37. They're never able to subdue it. So there's immense violence there. And then the Spanish Civil War, the Italians are involved from the get-go. They help ferry Franco's troops over from Morocco. They probably help them win by the second year. I mean, it think 3 or 4 years for them to win. And then starting as early as 1939, 1940, attack in Albania. So it's fascism. You can't think fascism without imperialism and war. So why did that come out of this book? Well, because he's governor, he's appointed with her governor of Cyrenaica. But before that, he's appointed because he had that military background, which was unusual in a fascist of his rank. There was one of the quadrivirs had been a general, and he was kind of chosen to be able to endear the fascists to the military. He was considered a rather infantile man, not a great general, but one who took good care of his soldiers. So Teruzzi was sort of unusual as being, a major, which was a relatively low rank, and then, always being promoted politically by the fascists. So you get a very strong sense of this fascism as creating disorder, always creating disorder and then claiming it's acting in the name of order. And he was perfect for that purpose, being a military man who knew everything about military order. And then along encouragement of the fascists, he was then breaking off of these regulations in the name of eliminating the disorder, in the name of fascism, and then of the nation, and then they would say also in the name of the king. So that violence was something. I think that's what probably, I don't know if it makes it unreadable or readable. You're just constantly, sometimes I was just in shock how much violence there was in the regime. And the same when you were looking in families and other areas where you weren't even looking for it, that it kept kind of coming out. And so in that sense, if you talk about it as a work of a public engagement or public intellectual, yes, one feels a kind of obligation, but above all, it seemed to restore the kind of organic nature of what a society under a regime like that, how it lives its life. And again, there is a kind of parabola, 20s to 30s. It's a very long regime, and it changes a lot over those years. And these men change a lot. Can you imagine what it's like, a Mussolini power for 20 years, and this man as well. Well, they start out young men, or hardy young men, and by the end they're speak about Mussolini to the people around him, worried that he was becoming sexually senile as a result of from a sexual engagement with his young lover, because the life cycle also meant that they had their families, and then he had kind of harem around him. This was the case of Mussolini, but Teruzzi was in that way a real kinsman. Okay, so let me stop here. I probably sort of moved away from some of the questions, and we can reprise some of them to move along. It's
May I ask a question? I know we're short on time, but most of our discussion tonight has been about Teruzzi, and of course the book is called The Perfect Fascist, but Liliana is really at the heart of your book. And as you said, she's the starting point, right, for your project. And I'm just wondering, since the very last line in your book describes her as a heroine manquée, that's the last word. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you ultimately see her, because is she an unrealized heroine? I mean, to my mind, she is, as you say, she's there in Cyrenaica. She's aware of the violence, right, in the colonies. She's aware of the violence of fascism, and yet seems sort of blinded to it. And I don't know, there's points where you suggest maybe there's even a kind of cultural mistranslation. That's how she's thinking about it, that she doesn't quite translate fascism into her terms. But I'm just wondering how you ultimately see her, and also whether the fact that you worked with her family, did you feel any responsibility towards her story? Was there a sense on the part of her family that you weren't sympathetic enough to her, or you were too sympathetic? I feel there's a great ambiguity around her in the end.
That's interesting. Okay, the let's start very, very clearly, dear potential readers. I had felt enormous ambivalence to have a set of documentation that showed an American Jewish woman as a victim of fascism. I said, boy, that's the easiest story in the world. That's the American story, victimization by the fascists. The question was, had she been victimized before the race laws, or when did it happen? It turned out it was actually 1930. And I said, this could be an easy story. American girl, ingenuous, very talented, goes to dark Europe, tricked by fascists, our career ruined, Me Too movement, comes home. Okay, this wasn't at all the story. I mean, in any case, it was the story. If it had been that, I wasn't interested, because in some sense that's a famous trope of of the United States, that somehow the fascism was mainly about anti-Semitism, and it mainly affected us, the U.S., because we fought them and we defeated them. It was a kind of convenient story. And so what is the problem? It turns out she's a fabulous character. And when I go back to the early letters, this is an amazing woman. I call her Liliana because people called her Liliana, and when they called her the wine man, that meant that they were really treating her awfully, and there was something going on. So the familiar just came kind of naturally to render her, whereas Teruzzi, that was commonly what he was called. And when he was called Attilio, that meant it was mother talking to him, or one of his lovers were talking to him, because Mussolini doesn't call him Attilio. He was probably, where's Teruzzi? So it was a comment. That was why this funny play, which I've thought about, we call the woman by her first name, the man by his last, but it's a kind of play on the way the language is used. But so for all of you out there, she is told to don't come back to Italy. Her parents are persecuted by the police in Italy. She's persecuted. She can't have any more friends, and yet she stays on. And she refuses to give, to accede to a negotiated divorce, some sort of special kind of contract breaking, which Mussolini would have sponsored. And then he goes to the church to get an annulment, and she fights it. She uses all her brilliant wits and her money and her intensity to fight it. She manages to get good friends, and her mother says, finally she's beaten Mussolini and the Pope. They won't give him an annulment. This turns out when they do give an annulment, these stories go on and on and on, but they're very, very engaging. And they're nothing like a divorce with all these incredible divorce lawyers involved and so on. And scabbers too, pretty dirty stuff. But in the end, there is something. She's like one of these heroines of Edith Wharton or Henry James, an enormous, goes up against evil, dark Europe, and then finally wins the battle the way she wants it to, or seems to win. That is, he's never able to get married again. Okay, and that leads to a lot of interesting problems for him, for his family. It means that's why he ends up in prison and loses all his stuff, because he doesn't have a smart, rich woman fighting for him. Or it helped Graziani, it helped many other fascists to have these women, just tussling and saying, you can't do that to him. What about us? What about the children? And the Italian legal system tended to be very responsive to them. So he lost out on that, that's for sure. We might say in a kind of Me Too way, great, sock it to that fascist by not giving him a divorce, by allowing him to annul his marriage so he can't get on with his life. But, again, whether this is history or whether this is kind of novelistic, thinking, moral thinking about the the book and what goes on in it, you know, I have to leave it to you to make these decisions about whether this is good. I mean, I had my feminist friends that said, well, you know, why don't you just, you know, dissolve the marriage and go to Nevada? I mean, go to Nevada and dissolve the marriage, go to Reno or go to Hungary, dissolve the marriage and start up again. Well, you know, there are all kinds of reasons, I suppose, at the time for doing that, good ones and bad ones. And when I ended up by calling her a heroine manquée, in some sense, you would have liked her to have been an anti-fascist. You would have liked it to have that kind of Hollywood narrative ending or flow. That is, she realizes that she'd been a fool, that she was ingenuous to embrace fascism or this fascist, and you know, gone and lived her life. And instead of fighting him. In the end, when you know America's on the side of the good, and she can say, I was never a fascist, I'm an anti-fascist, and I'm continuing now my resistance to this dissolved marriage, you know, and in that way, a kind of anti-fascist. So it's part of the moral complexity. People just don't sync with, you know, the way the political narrative is set up. I mean, people can't be sort of pressed into the molds, even though Teruzzi certainly becomes so emblematic, so much an embodiment. That's a sign, of course, too, of his weakness as a man, cocoons himself in power, and therefore he becomes sort of part, you know, a zealot, always sort of representing the story over time, and his millions of different uniforms and all of his medals. You know, he becomes, if you want, the essence of the fascist regime.
I have a question too, but I don't know whether we should go to questions from readers, possibly.
I think, Giorgio, you should ask your question, and then we've got, I think, maybe time for one question from the audience. So why don't we do that?
Okay, well, more than a question, is just another observation that I find the discussion on the multi-centered church. I mean, the fact that the church is not just Rome, it's also Milan, and that you had access probably to documents of the Sacra Rota, which are not easy to find. They're not widely circulating, in my understanding. And so there is this fantastic narrative about this tension between Rome and Milan. She sides with Milan, and then there is the Archbishop of New York. I mean, she's incredibly resourceful in finding allies. So there is also inner story within the church. It's not in the singular anymore, and that's also adds to our understanding of what happened to the church during fascism in a way in which it's not very common. So
yeah, it's strange as you bring that up. This book sounds like, how could it possibly be understood? But I think, you know, one almost has to think of it like an opera. You know, you go along and all of a sudden you find yourself in the Inquisition, and then you're out on the battlefield, and then you know the harps are playing. But you know, it's part of a big narrative flow that takes you, you know, over these more than 20 years, because it really does start with his youth in this amazing city that was Milan, you know, sort of the second city of continental Europe after Paris, cinema, and it's, you know, it's very lively theater and lively opera and a lot of melodrama. So he's sort of coming out of that. This, you know, Teruzzi is a little like a Rodolfo in La Bohème, you know, with the women thinking about women and thinking about future and fortune and so on and so forth.
I think we have time for one audience question, and then we can wrap up for the evening. And again, I want to thank Victoria de Grazia and Giorgio Bertellini and Pamela Ballinger for joining us this evening. The question from our viewer is, when did Liliana Weinman receive Teruzzi's archive, and why did she keep it after the annulment? The personal papers and photographs of a fascist who betrayed her and bonded with Nazis.
Yes, that's a good question. So what she did, she really suffered from not having been able to keep more of the stuff. that is all she had in the end was a few letters because from him and pictures of him. That's all she had because she in effect was renounced. He said, don't come back, that's it. And then destroyed anything he had because there were many, many compromising letters because he wrote her everything. He tried to clarify his ideas. He used her as she was his ballast. She was his great love at that. And so he confided so much in her. So she kept this as her memories of the marriage. And when all her life, and that was and left that. And now I sorted that not very well because I'm not an archivist. Boy, that's a very hard work being an archivist. So now it will go to the Evo Institute, which collects lots of family papers of Jewish families, especially from Europe and in New York City, and it should be then available. It's not very big. It's what we call 7 feet altogether when everything was pulled out. It's not that big, but again, you sort of patch together other sources to keep filling things out. And the fact is, an annulment record, there's several volumes, and then I was able to get from one appeals court some important record at Pavia. They're in Latin, church Latin mostly. Very, very hard to read because they're legal documents. And so, I did get help. All of this required a lot of help. Military, very hard if you're not in the military to understand military rank just to start, much less, the structure of command, the obligations, the virtues that soldiers like. Ditto with the church. It's so hard to understand what the Catholic Church is about, even if one happens to be Catholic or not to mention, goodness knows, Judaism. Once you start to get into private lives, that people have moral codes and outlooks coming from their backgrounds, whether it's a family background or a professional background. And that's what I found so extraordinary to see. Yes, fascism is making demands, but fascism itself has a confusion of ideas about what is the good. Yes, nationalism, the duce, loyalty to the country, and so on. But then that builds on all different kinds of moral codes, and then comes also in conflict with them. That is, in the end, this was the problem that Teruzzi had. The duces failed in the wars. That was pretty clear. So do you remain loyal to the duce, or do you remain loyal to the nation? At which point you have to renounce the duce and find another duce. And that was a ethical problem, which he fudged. That is, he said, don't know. I'm going to just have to stay loyal to the duce because I really cannot imagine not being close to him anymore. I can't imagine. I can't take my courage in my hands to start an independent life. And that's, one of those moments where you really catch him out, his ethical bankruptcy, because that meant also with terrible consequences for his little family as well as him.
Well, thank you so much. And Giorgio and Pamela, if there's any last words you'd like to say before we part with our audience this evening. But once again, I just want to thank you, Victoria, for joining us from across the pond, for zooming in from the UK to talk about this marvelous accomplishment, this really fascinating work of history, which you can buy from Literati Bookstore. I'm putting a link in the chat again one more time. And of course, if you're watching a recording later, there are links in the description below. But I'll leave it to our panelists to say any last words before I sign everybody off.
Thank you for writing it.
I want to say thank you to Victoria again for writing this. It's amazing, fascinating, and we barely scratched the surface tonight, so that gives you an idea of the richness of the book.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Literati. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much, audience, for listening in, and I hope reading the book as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We hope you all continue to stay safe and be well, and hope to have
Yeah.
you in the bookstore sometime on the other side of all this. And until then, take care and good night, all.
Good
Good
night.
night. Thank you so much.